As we enter into the second month of Palestinian-Israel conflict, it seems that there's no end in sight, at least not in foreseeable future. It has become very, very divisive. Anybody who's supporting the Palestine or Palestinians is actually being called anti-Semitic.
Right now, we are seeing how this word anti-Semitic is being brandished, right, all around us, and it is being used to try to, in fact, silence and shut down any and all voices. What we are observing happening, what has led, in fact, what led to October 7th, what led to now the absolutely inhumane, genocidal, disproportionate attack by Israel that is ongoing on the civilian population, largely children and women in Gaza. I am in academia, and people have come to me, especially some untenured faculty, who are much more vulnerable because they don't yet have tenure in the university, and they have been told in no uncertain terms that they should stay quiet, especially those who have, tried to even share some websites or URLs where alternative accounts about what has unfolded or even provide a longer backstory history of the conflict.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Amina from New Wave Global. As we enter into the second month of Palestinian-Israel conflict, it seems that there's no end in sight, at least not in foreseeable future. And what we are actually noticing is that the reverberations of this conflict is being felt worldwide. It has become very, very divisive. Any pro-Palestinian encouragement, any pro-Palestinian talks, and anybody who's supporting the Palestine or Palestinians is actually being called anti-Semitic. It seems like people have a major lack of understanding when it comes to anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism. To discuss this and further, I have with me Professor Fawzia Khan. Assalamu alaikum, Professor.
Ji, assalamu alaikum. How are you, Amna?
I'm good. It's a pleasure to have you again. Professor Fawzia is a professor of English at Montclair University and has a very special interest in Middle Eastern politics with a special focus on Palestine-Israel conflict. In fact, she has been engaged in activism, pro-Palestinian activism, and has also been teaching courses on pro-Palestine-Israel conflict, politics, and all. So she is an expert in the field. As I mentioned in my introductory comments, Professor, that it seems like that everything that is pro-Palestinian is being labeled as anti-Semitic, and people are being penalized for that. Have you seen something similar? And can you explain a little the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
Thank you for that question, Amna. I think it's an important one. But what I want to preface my remarks with is a sense of the history of the use of this word. So while you are, of course, correct in observing and stating that right now we are seeing how this word anti-Semitic is being brandished, right, all around us, and it is being used to try to, in fact, silence and shut down any and all voices that are trying, are engaged in the attempt, that are trying to set the record, the historical record straight of what we are observing happening, what has led, in fact, what led to October 7th, what led to now the absolutely inhumane, genocidal, disproportionate attack by Israel that is ongoing on the civilian population, largely children and women in Gaza, right, in response to October 7th. So, yes, anybody who tries to explain this situation, especially by taking an account of the history of the creation of the state of Israel, which is an occupying state. It is the last, what we should call, settler colonial states in the world. And we can talk a little bit about that as well. Any such person, whatever their field of work, wherever they are being censored, they are being told on social media, they are being attacked. In their places of work, there is, and I have certainly observed that. I am in academia, and people have come to me, especially some untenured faculty, who are much more vulnerable because they don't yet have tenure in the university, and they have been told in no uncertain terms that they should stay quiet, especially those who have, tried to even share some websites or URLs where alternative accounts about what has unfolded or even provide a longer backstory history of the conflict. They are told, do not share such information. They are targeted by organizations, off-campus organizations like the ADL, the American, the Anti-Defamation League, which is in fact itself a very pro-Zionist organization. And it is its job or its mission is to survey people, especially academics, to see, who is speaking out, in a way that could be construed as a critique of Israel. Let's brand them immediately anti-Semitic because they have figured out, right? Yeah. They have figured out that to throw that word silences everybody because people become very afraid. I mean, who wants to be called a racist, right? For standing up for the right of people? Nobody. But the truth of the matter is that this is a ploy. It is a very clever ploy.
Yeah, it's just being used as a tool to silence people.
Of course, because to criticize, I mean, that's like saying, if I, as a Muslim, criticize practices that are, people say these are in the name of Islam, or let's say I'm from Pakistan and I criticize certain things that the Pakistani state might be doing against some of its citizens, that therefore I should be shut up because I am anti-Pakistan and I am anti-Muslim. Think about it. How does that make any sense, right? That is like saying that there is only one kind of narrative, one point of view, one way of understanding, millions of people and hundreds and thousands of years of history. This is not correct and it is not real, right?
And it's definitely not anti-Semitic. That's the
how. So exactly. Again, my question is, if you see, and it's, let's say, as a person of non-Jewish background, and I am a scholar and I'm a historian and I'm a professor of literature and I study a particular region of the world. And in this case, I'm looking at the Middle East and I'm looking at the creation of the state of Israel. I can see, right, that the state of Israel did not exist for all eternity, that it came into being as a modern nation state in 1948. That is quite recent, right?
Right.
And when I study it, I will also read and I will see from documents that are also Jewish documents, Arab documents, documents found in all kinds of archives, right, from all types of points of view as to how and why did the state come about. And then I will go and try to understand, for example, the movement called Zionism, because it is Zionism that gave rise to even the idea of a national home or a nation state for largely European Jews, Jews who had for millennia lived in Europe,
yes,
who were then persecuted during the Holocaust by Europeans, Christian Europeans, largely. How does my pointing this out as the backdrop, where then Zionism turns to its oppressors who are Europeans, and in cahoots with them comes up with a plan to solve the Jewish problem, which is what European anti-Semites wanted, right? They wanted to get rid of their Jewish populations. This has nothing to do with Arabs or Muslims or anything, right? This is a European problem, European problem,
and that's
a white European problem.
That's the distinction people need to make, that any pro-Palestinian comment or any pro-Palestinian post is not anti-Semitic. It's not against Jews.
No, because in fact, the Arabs of Palestine welcomed the Jews who were fleeing pogroms and hardships in Europe at the turn of the last century. They said, welcome, come, you are our cousins. There are correspondences and letters and documents that attest to this, from the highest to the lowest. I was just reading a correspondence between the person who became, the first king of Iraq, of modern Iraq, King Faisal, right? And between him and Mr. Felix Frankfurter, who was an aide to Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann became the first, leader, the first premier of Israel after Israel was created. And the correspondence between these two people attests to the fact that Faisal is saying to Mr. Frankfurter, welcome to the Jews. You are our cousins. There is enough room in our hearts, enough room on the land for both of our peoples who have together suffered, from white colonial racism and white, supremacist kind of arguments against us and our people and our history. We can come together. We, in fact, share certain things and certain challenges and certain struggles. And I am sure that moving forward, we can find a way to coexist, in this land. I mean, this is in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference.
Yeah, so that's the backdrop. Yeah, and that's the backdrop.
How is that anti-Semitic? How is that anti-Semitic?
And that's the backdrop that people are unaware of or are refusing to acknowledge. So coming back to that, it seems like that the persecution of any pro-Palestinian comment, any pro-Palestinian encouragement has been penalized everywhere. People have been persecuted, and it's happening in all echelons of the society. It's happening in the academic world. We have several examples. You yourself have been by AMCHA. You are on that roster of professors which are being watched or being frowned upon, and as teachers of Palestinian Israel courses, Middle Eastern courses, and you can see it in schools. Even you could see it in the Congress. You're seeing it everywhere. The Rashida Tlaib,
unfortunately,
Rashida Tlaib, you know about her, the only American Palestinian representative who was censured for some pro-Palestinian comments that she made on her social media accounts. So
yes, Amna, that there is everything that you've said is correct and true. And it is obviously very disheartening when we are surrounded by a news cycle in which we are hearing about these kinds of attempts, which can only be called, McCarthyist, right? They are reminiscent of the McCarthy era in this country, in which people, with progressive views, on the what we might call on the progressive left, because of their those ideas, were being shunned, were being pushed out of jobs, were being hounded, were being imprisoned. And we thought that America had left that behind, right? Because there is such a big commitment in its own constitution to the freedom of speech, right? And so we have come a long way from the McCarthy era in the last century to now 2023, but the same tactics are once again now being deployed, and you can see that in the examples that you have cited. So of course, that is extremely disheartening. There are many, and some are really bad. Like, for example, the students who spoke in favor of a just resolution and peace and justice in Palestine. And none of them were there saying death to Jews or doing any kind of horrible anti-Semitic ranting or anything. They were simply standing up and speaking in favor of Palestine and expressing anger, righteous anger at their own administration and people who were refusing to call a spade a spade. I mean, what is happening is a genocide, and people who refuse to acknowledge that are aiding and abetting in that genocide. Like, so they were saying, as are the rest of us, please stand up and be counted on the right side of history, because tomorrow you will be very, very ashamed when it turns out that, what you have done is, participate in crimes against humanity. And for just saying that, which is what students do, right? And there are many other groups speaking out for, the state of Israel. I mean, campuses are supposed to allow for this, right? Yes. And they're just for saying that, I mean, professors came down after them, other students came after them, and then that the phenomenon called doxing started, right? Mm-hmm. So which is so dangerous. So their names, their photographs, I mean, some of them going up on the sides of trucks that were pulling up.
Yes, I was going to say, there are trucks with students' names and information and images on them. That's the worst kind of doxing that you can.
I mean, today, as any other day, right, to insist and clarify that there is absolutely no link between the two, that in fact, to be anti-Zionist may be the most pro-Semitic thing you can do, because in a way, to be anti-Zionist is to be against the idea of settler colonialism, right? It's not to be against the religion of Judaism.
Yes.
Because Zionism was never a Jewish idea. Zionism was a secular nationalist ideology. It had nothing to do with religion. Yes, the idea was, let us resettle Jews from Europe and give them a national home as part of, the general decolonization that was going on around the world. And
Correct.
Certain Jews of Europe, they hit themselves to that wagon, starting with Herzl and even before him, others. And for many, it really became a way to find a place to exert power in an era when power now was going to be understood or be practiced primarily through nation states, because the era of the empires were gone. They were done, right? Mm-hmm. So if you did not have your own nation, maybe you could not be part of this idea of, world being taken seriously by the world. So you can understand where that idea of a nation state was coming from. But what very quickly happened, in order to make it palatable, you see, the Zionists, they tried to explain it to the world, to their own Jewish people as well as other people, in terms that could not be refuted on a moral or ethical ground, which is to say, well, we are returning to a land,
holy land,
which was given to us, 2,000 years ago by God. But you see, that as a faculty member that I have known and respected a long time, also works in the English department at my university. He has always pointed this out very correctly and to the point, is that is a mystification. That is a myth. I mean, by that logic, anybody can get up and say, I have to go to Australia. My God gave it to me. I now will kick out all the New Zealanders because really in my holy book, God made me, gave me that land. I mean, that doesn't hold any water, you understand? That is a mystification. And to state that is not to be anti-Jewish. It is to be anti-Zionist. The two projects and the two ideologies, the two things, the two realities are entirely different, which is also the reason, Amna, that you have so many Jews, particularly the ultra-Orthodox Jews, who really adhere to the Torah and to the law as written down in the Torah, in the holy book of the Jews, they feel this is an abomination, that Israel is an abomination for the Jews.
Actually, to your point, in fact, very recently, a rabbi who was attending a meeting that was being held by President Biden for his political supporters actually interrupted him and asked him to call for a ceasefire. And it's not an unorthodox Jew. It was a rabbi who did that. So to your point,
so he would have been an ultra-orthodox. I'm sorry, I didn't mean unorthodox. I meant, the extremely orthodox Jews. There is a whole sector of them, and there are go by particular names. They very much have from day one, not today, but from before the creation of the state of Israel, have never accepted that this is the right or the moral thing for people of the Jewish faith to get behind. They don't believe it. They say this is against their religious teachings.
In fact,
yeah.
No, I was just going to say that JVP, the Jewish Voice for Palestinians, also is actually begging Israelis not to use this rhetoric, not to use this, not to kill people in their name, because they definitely do not want to have any part in it.
Absolutely. And I think, going along with this argument, therefore, there are a couple of other points, which is that a lot of people will say, again, saying it's anti-Semitic because, it shows that if you say that Israel is an occupying state, you are going against, the right of Jews to live there, and that Israel, in fact, is not an occupying state at all, and the reason they give is that the state of Israel was actually created in 1948, as we've said, but it was created under the auspices of the United Nations plan, right? The partition plan for Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of supporters of Israel, Jewish and non-Jewish, will say that. They will defend it by saying, well, it was created by the UN. Well, it's fascinating. What right did the UN, please ask, have the right to give the land of people who were living there, the Palestinians, to somebody else? How did they come up with this plan, right? And so the question becomes, who has the right to start parceling out lands? And the UN did it because the UN was under pressure from the colonial powers at that time, who were losing their empire in India, who were losing their empire here, there, and everywhere. And they realized that this region is full of oil, this region is going to be very powerful, moving forward, that this would be the place where they needed to keep their foot in the door in order to, continue to hold power in the world. I mean, somebody who has held power doesn't want to give it up. And certainly England and France and then America, none of them, they were not interested in giving up their power. So they actually, through the UN, ended up creating this state, which, serves their purposes. So really, for all intents and purposes, this state of Israel today serves as the US's watchdog in that area, doing the US government's bidding to keep everybody else in line and under the control and under the imperial boot of the US. And obviously the, England, France, and other European powers also are interested in keeping the status quo going. So it is not out of that they are, there are plenty of anti-Semitic people within the governments, the parliaments, the leaders of all of these countries. But they support Israel not out of any real, true love of Jewish people or the Jewish religion. They are doing it out of realpolitik because they understand that, by supporting Israel, they are in fact ensuring their own political careers, right?
Yeah.
Because they are heavily funded. A lot of their donors come from a variety of, communities with ties to Israel. and so on. And so they are very tied to the hip, you see, to this machine, this political machine or machinery, right?
Yes.
In which a foreign country, in this case Israel, ends up dictating the policies, particularly the foreign policy of the United States of America. And anybody who runs for public office, who criticizes Israel, knows that they are digging their own grave, which is why people like Biden and all of these Congress people who are just shutting down any resolutions that say, all they are saying is, even to call, they're not even willing to back a humanitarian ceasefire. I mean, how disappointing is that?
Actually, just, that is actually provides a really good segue to my next question, where I was going to highlight that it's not that any pro-Palestinian voice that is coming from Muslims is being censored. It's just across the board. Any pro-Palestinian support, any pro-Palestinian voice, period, is being censored. And a great example of that is the Florida bill that was presented by Angie Nixon, and it was floored. People turned her back towards her when she presented the bill.
Yes, I'm glad you brought her up. Obviously, when people like her speak out, it is so encouraging and moving, and she spoke so eloquently, and she broke down several times, crying, yes. That I don't want babies to be killed.
Yes.
That is her stand. And she made it clear that she will speak up, even though the voices of the powerful are arraigned against her and trying to shut her up. Because she says she is speaking for the people who elected her, the minority communities in her district, the people who are the poor and the dispossessed, the people of color, the Black and people, the African Americans and others like them. She is standing for them and with them. And those communities, they understand now what is going on in a way that is they understand it in a very visceral way, because they have experienced similar realities. For example, I will tell you, I wanted to mention this to you because, a week ago, as you know, that while all of these horrors are happening, Palestinians around the world and Palestinians and their supporters in this country are not backing down. They are, despite their own, so many of their own families being killed and so many tragedies unfolding for them, they are not backing down. They are coming together to try to find spaces where they can organize and speak the truth to power. And one of the events I went to last week at Columbia, which was the 5th place that finally gave them, said, yes, you can come in and hold your Palestinian literature festival, because it was the time of the Palestine, it's called Pal Fest. Okay. I mean, no other space in the entire university was giving them room to come together. And the people who were brought together there, this is the chapel at which also the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. spoke, and he spoke out against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. So it's a historic place of resistance against power and authority that the government uses to squash voices of dissent and voices standing up for justice, right? So it was a beautiful space to hold this. It was packed to the hilt. And, there were several hundred people there. Then there was an overflow crowd that went to the Riverside Church. And there were more than between 2,000 to 3,000 people who joined online on YouTube, they're in real time. So it shows you that people are really they are desperate for these alternative spaces and alternative voices, because they have had enough of the Zionist, white supremacist, racist, imperialist narrative that has been shoved down our throats for too long, right? And they have become wise to the fact that when you criticize the state of Israel and its atrocities against Palestinians that didn't start 2 weeks ago, but have been ongoing for at least the last 75 years, that you are not an anti-Semite for calling out and pointing to that truth, that reality of suffering, right?
You're
that
right. And
I just wanted, sorry, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead. I'll let you finish
No,
your
so
thought.
Amna, I just wanted to say that in that context, then there, because this connects to the question you had asked about Angie and what she represents and what her brave stand in Congress, which was shut down 102 to 2, right? Unbelievable.
Painful, yes.
Painful. And, that stand is something that people of color in this country and other minorities, oppressed groups around the world, they understand that in their bones, in their veins. That's what I mean when I say it is a visceral truth. And one of the speakers at the Lit Fest was the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, the African-American writer named Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, I highly recommend his writing to anybody. He writes beautifully in accessible prose, and he spoke so eloquently because the people who were speaking that day were Palestinian writers, poets, and scholars. There were African-American writers, scholars, activists. There was Natalie Dyers was there, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning Latina poet. I mean, there was somebody representing Jewish voices of peace. So it wasn't only people who were Palestinian. There were
Muslims,
of all backgrounds, all
Yes.
Muslims, certainly not. Rashid Khalidi, who is the leading voice on Palestinian rights, Noura Erakat, professor of law, also Palestinian. I mean, they represent between them different backgrounds from Palestine. Rashid himself, I believe, is Christian. So it doesn't matter. It's because this is what they
This is about
want
humanity.
you to think.
Humanity.
No, they want you to think deliberately. This is also
Yes.
an Israeli Zionist narrative that somehow this is all about Jews against Muslims. This has nothing to do with Jews against
correct.
Muslims.
I was actually going to point out that the more that they're trying to squash these voices, you're seeing more and more support generated. In fact, there are a few incidents over the last month where there are about 500 American Jews and allies that actually staged a sit-down on the floor of the Congressional House building asking for ceasefire. They were all Jews. None of them were Muslims. There was a major intersection blocked in Chicago on October 27th, and those were all American Jews and allies. Again, there was a lockdown or a shutdown of the Grand Central Terminal.
Yes, I was actually there.
You were there. Yes, so you witnessed it. It was primarily Jews. So that's the rhetoric that, it's all against the rhetoric that media is creating and promoting this anti-Semitic.
Absolutely. And I think there, again, just to bring it back to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is African-American, who said that it wasn't until he went a year or so ago for the last Lit Fest, he was invited to Palestine, and he visited the areas in Palestine. He also went to Jerusalem in Israel, and he said it's when you see the conditions of the people and how people are living, when you see those walls of barbed wire, when you see young Israeli men roaming about with guns, right? And machine guns. And, you see old Palestinian women being held up at checkpoints, right? To try to get from point A to point B. When you see all of that, and he talked about how when he was being taken to see some site, and the person accompanying him, the guide, was Palestinian. The Palestinian told him, from this point onwards to there, I can't go with you. If you want to go there, you have to go by yourself. And Ta-Nehisi Coates asked him, but why is that? And he says, well, I'm Palestinian. And Ta-Nehisi Coates shared with us in the audience how he knew what that was. He knew what that was, right?
Yes.
And by which he meant, because as a Black man with the history of slavery behind him, right? Yes. Growing up in this country, which is still so racist and such a dangerous place for especially Black men, right? Certain places are off limits to them. You are seen there, you'll be shot at before they even question who you are, right? Or what you are doing there. He understood that system, and the word for that system is apartheid, right? One set of rules, free movement for one people, control, lockdown, checkpoints, prison for another.
Correct.
So when you observe that firsthand, how can you not be moved? How can you not? And he said, you do not need, people want to say, oh my God, this is so complicated. It is so complex. It is he said, it's not though. You don't really need a PhD in Middle Eastern studies to understand what has been happening and what is continuing to happen, right?
Correct.
Against Palestinians over there. So in that case, what I just wanted to end by saying that I think we have to understand that people like him, people like this representative Angie Nixon and others, they are in solidarity with Palestinians because they understand what that struggle is all about. And so we have to really talk about that. We have to, this is not, when people say, well, how come, what makes you so, such a supporter of Palestinian rights? What is, who are they to you? My God, what kind of question is that? There are Pakistanis also who ask that of me. And it really makes me feel so ashamed of them and so upset, because I wonder, what kind of training have you had? Because this is not about me being for Palestinians. I am on the side of all people who are voiceless, who are crushed, who are not being given their rights, right? I mean, how can you be for Kashmiris and not be for Palestinians? How can you be for Palestinians and not be for African Americans crushed right here?
Or Ukrainians, for that matter.
Oh, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to say that you don't even necessarily have to be the minority group to understand. Anybody who has a little bit of passion, a little bit of humanity left in them would be supporting that. And a perfect example of that was when more than 100 congressional staffers walked out and asked for their representatives to demand ceasefire. So it's springing up. The support is springing up everywhere.
Yes.
And my question to you about this is that how come even everybody is asking for it, but our representatives in the government cannot even utter the word ceasefire? For what is stopping them? I mean, the best anyone has done at all is ask for a humanitarian pause. Nobody has said ceasefire. Why is that?
Yes, and I think that, we've been talking around this and about it, frankly, so far. And I think that the reason is pretty clear. And the reason is because they are beholden to donors from whom they get lots of money to stay in their seats. And they don't want those donors to pull the funding out, and then they will lose their seats. I mean, it's I believe personally that it is a very calculated, but ultimately it will not serve them. It's a calculated move that won't really help them in the long run, because the world is watching and their own constituents are watching, right? Yes. They are seeing what's going down. And so I think this is what Rashid Khalidi said in, with due apologies to sex workers, and he said that, but I thought it was brilliant. He said, politicians are whores, right? They will go to the highest bidder because they are dependent on money. This is a very, unfortunately, to run for any political public office, you need to raise a lot of money. Yeah. And so if donors, who come to you and promise you and give you lots of money, they want something back in return. They want you to support their policies. And Israel and Israeli-backed groups in this country, Zionist political action committees such as AIPAC, for example, they have huge pockets, and they are the king makers and the king breakers, and they will back only those candidates for political office who will come out and say, we are with Israel, right or wrong. But this is what I'm saying, is that now people are beginning to see more and more that this is what is happening. And people, the average voter doesn't want this to happen because, as I think I had mentioned to you, there is a candidate who is running for Congress from, I think, the state of Texas, I want to say, maybe, is sort of getting together his candidacy for next year. And his name is Akwan, the last name AGW. I don't know if you can look it up. Agwan, but in any case, he has said, right? And look at this. This is something that maybe your viewers don't know, but in the 2022 cycle, because this is what I was mentioning about funding and donors, APAC, which is the American Israeli Political Action Committee, right? Mm-hmm. Their super PAC spent almost $40 million. $40 million directed at defeating progressive Democrats in the primaries. That was just last year. Because they understood that the progressive caucus, as we have seen, are the only few voices that are today standing up to say, let's call for a ceasefire, let's talk about the Palestinians in an objective manner, and the suffering that is going on and has been going on.
But
right?
Should these representatives also be mindful of the fact that if they do not listen to the voices of their own constituents, their constituents are going to look elsewhere? In fact, during even yesterday, the elections, I heard a lot of talk about people looking for other options. So
so that will ultimately happen. The thing is that the big money talks before the little money. Now, the local constituents don't bring that kind of, certainly won't be bringing $40 million to the table to try and defeat your opponent, right? So, correct. I mean, of course, the power is with the people. Ultimately, that is the real source of power. And I think people should really wake up and say that's where it's at. And I think, for example, in the next election, it seems almost certain that Michigan, which is a swing state, will not vote as it did in the last national elections for Biden and the Democrats, because it is largely, most of its voters there are of Arab descent or Muslim descent, and people are really disgusted. They are calling President Joe Genocide Joe because he is supporting the genocide by refusing to call out Israel for what it's doing, by refusing to put an end to it, by continuing, in fact, to send more arms and more shipment of arms and more money to Israel, when what is going on in full view during his leadership is a genocide of the Palestinian people. So they will see this, and this will happen, and hopefully this will, start to shift the grounds in a way that this, 75 plus year lock on our politicians in favor of Israel, right or wrong, will erode. It has to, because otherwise there will be no justice. And without justice, we know that there is never any peace. So the question to the electorate should be, and to their leaders, do you want to really see this world go up in smoke? I mean, that is where we are headed, to another Armageddon. I mean, if Israel doesn't stop what it's doing, the big fear, of course, is that Iran, Hezbollah, etc., they will jump into the fight. They don't want to do it. It's not in their interest. But if they do, then all bets are off.
Yes,
and what begins, then where will this conflict, how will it affect the world? It's not going to stop there.
It seems like, Israel is not listening to voice of reason anyways, because they demanded the resignation of the UN Secretary General when he asked for ceasefire.
Yes, and so they are trying to also brand him as anti-Semite, right? To go back to our earlier discussion. Because he is asking for peace and saying, Israel, you have gone overboard. Just even to say that makes him an anti-Semite. I mean, that is ludicrous, right? But this is what their strategy has been all along, and they feel that they have, this can help them they can just keep doing that and keep winning. But the fact is that people are seeing this, and now in an age of social media particularly, you have people weighing in from all different countries, cultures, backgrounds, races, ethnicities, blah blah blah. And I mean, it's amazing to see what people are saying, and from that you can gauge that the world opinion has shifted. I wanted to mention Scott Ritter, who is a former military analyst for the US Department of Defense, who has come out and has given interviews in recent days in which he has said, for CNN and others, I'm sorry, but in the world of public opinion, this is a done deal. I mean, Israel is not, to support it is not morally viable anymore. And Jews of conscience, and even those sort of Jews who have been totally brainwashed by the Israeli propaganda, and think that any criticism of Israel is somehow anti-Semitic, even they are agreeing, and even they are saying that this has gone far enough, and that indeed they are acknowledging that world opinion has shifted. And they are worried and they are scared, and I can understand and empathize with their worry and scare. If you were such a small population and you had suffered through the ages and were always, hounded and penalized in any country you found yourself in, and then it all culminates in this awful Holocaust in which 6 million of your already small population is wiped out,
right,
in the most inhumane way possible, and then you get this state, and you think, okay, now at least we have a state where we can be free. And that state is now shown its true colors, and the world can see that it is run by right-wing fascists, and that it is now committing against another people the same genocide that was committed against your own. You are going to be worried.
Yes.
Of course you are going to be worried, and you should be worried. And that is why I say that if you are truly concerned about the fate of Israel, the fate of the Jews in Israel and Jews worldwide, it is in your interest to stop this mass murder, to stop the government of Israel, to call upon world powers to stop aiding and abetting Israel, because this help is going to backfire, and it is going to, already it is, causing a rise in anti-Semitism along with Islamophobia, right?
Yeah.
And this will only continue, right? So, I mean, to be anti-Zionist, especially today, is the need of the hour, and it is the only way to safeguard the rights of the Jews, of the Jewish people, both inside and outside of Israel. So I don't understand why anyone or how anyone cannot see that connection, because it is clear as day, at least it is to me.
It is. And I would like to ask you to end this conversation by the poem that you just recited to me. I think it lays out the message very clearly that we've been trying to give for the last hour here.
Sure. I think that it was, if I can find it, yes, let me look for it. It is a poem that I have been thinking about a lot since these latest atrocities, round of atrocities kind of was unleashed, right, on the people of Gaza, and now we see also it spreading to Jenin and to to the West Bank and so on, and it made me think about this poem called A Dream Deferred, which was written by Langston Hughes, who was one of the leading lights, one of the leading poets of the Harlem Renaissance. And so, of course, what he was writing about was, he was writing from the perspective of a Black man in the United States, right? At a time when this was pre-civil rights, right? And so if we think of how ingrained racism still is, right? And racist policies towards people of color and particularly African Americans to this day. And, we don't have to go far. We can even just say the name George Floyd to understand what we're talking about, right? You can imagine that in the 30s and 40s when Hughes is writing, right, that at that time the status, the place, the of African Americans was very, very precarious, right? So he writes this beautiful poem, which in a way, I just feel, Amna, it totally applies to the situation as it pertains to the Palestinians. And it is a question that I think he ends with, which we have to ask when, people are being constantly put on the defensive and asked, well, do you, are you against Hamas? Are you against what happened on October 7th? When they ask that question without any view to the history and the historical circumstances that led up to something that nobody, is going to defend the killing of anybody who is, a civilian or an innocent in a struggle. But at the same time, when that's the first and only thing in which you get stuck, let's talk about Hamas, and Hamas is the great evil, without understanding what led to Hamas and what led to some of the Hamas militants going into Israel, then you are in fact not at all paying attention to the larger historical context within which this ongoing struggle is occurring. And I think that's a terrible shortcoming and a mistake. And until and unless people can move beyond that, there will be no resolution to this issue, because only when the occupation ends, then we can talk about who's to blame for this or that and how to fix the situation so that, the same cycle of violence doesn't keep getting repeated. But for that to happen, dreams of people have to be respected. Palestinian dreams of a free homeland and to live in freedom and dignity, that dream has to come true. If the Jews of Europe had a dream that they should be free in a land that they could call their own, then they must understand that the native Palestinians dream to live on their lands and to have a land to call their own, where they can be free of humiliation. That also has to come true, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So let me just read the poem, Dream Deferred, by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? Does it explode? And what we witnessed was an explosion, right?
Yeah. I don't think there's anything more left to say. This really says it all. Thank you. We'll leave it at this. I hope we have created some food for thought for a lot of people here. And thank you so much.